Living in Asheville, North Carolina, I had woven myself into the fabric of local life with a routine that brought both comfort. My daily visits to a cozy coffee shop downtown were my way of connecting with the community, a place where the aroma of freshly brewed coffee mingled with the hum of quiet conversations and the occasional clatter of laptops. It was a small haven where everyone seemed to know each other, or at least recognized a familiar face. That particular day began like any other. I strolled into the shop, the bell over the door announcing my arrival. The barista, a young guy named Tyler with an easy smile, greeted me by name as I ordered my usual black coffee, no sugar. With my cup in hand, I settled into my favorite spot by the window, a little nook that caught just enough morning light to read by. I unfolded the local paper, scanning the headlines when an older man approached my table. He was unremarkable at first glance, with a weathered face and clothes that spoke of frequent travel rather than fashion. "Mind if I sit?" he asked, his voice gravelly but polite. Surprised, I nodded. I was here to meet new people after all, though I generally gravitated towards a younger crowd. Today, I thought, why not? Maybe he had interesting stories to share. As he sat, he introduced himself as Jack, a traveling salesman who frequently drove along I-40, spanning from Ohio to Asheville. His questions started off innocuously enough: where I worked, where I lived, and whether I had any family nearby. They were typical small talk, I supposed, but something in the way he asked felt probing, almost meticulous. I answered vaguely, steering the conversation away from personal details and towards him. Jack shared tidbits about his life on the road, the endless highways, the towns that blended one into the next. Yet, each story seemed carefully curated, leaving more unsaid than spoken. As our chat wound down, he asked my age, his eyes narrowing slightly as if trying to place me in some unseen context. "I'm 29, I said, noticing his disbelief. I had always looked younger than my age, often mistaken for a teenager. Laughing it off, I pulled out my ID to show him, a party trick that usually amused. He studied it for a moment, then handed it back with a brisk, "Thanks for the chat," before standing up to leave abruptly. Puzzled by his sudden departure, I shrugged it off and went back to my coffee, ordering another cup as Tyler checked in. "Was that old man bothering you?" he asked, a concerned furrow in his brow. "No, it wasn't anything I couldn't handle," I reassured him, appreciating his concern but not thinking much of the interaction. The next night, my on-again, off-again boyfriend, Tom, suggested a spur-of-the-moment adventure to a new strip club a town over. It was a wild idea, fueled by the thrill of doing something completely out of our norm. As we settled in, Tom leaned over, his voice low. "Someone offered the manager $500 for you to do a set. You interested?" My initial reaction was a mix of shock and curiosity. Who would offer that much just to see me? Part of me was intrigued, another part apprehensive. I decided to find out who it was. My heart skipped when I saw him, Jack from the coffee shop, sitting there with a smirk that didn't reach his eyes. Later that evening, he cornered me, his earlier facade of the harmless old man slipping as he recounted chilling tales from his time in Vietnam, particularly how he had killed young women and children. His words sent a cold shiver down my spine, and I quickly excused myself, finding safety in a group of friends, making sure I was never alone for the rest of the night. Jack left without further incident, but his presence and stories haunted me. I returned to my daily life, shaken but trying to maintain a semblance of normalcy, until a coworker approached me with horrifying news. A young girl had been brutally attacked and left for dead behind one of the local bars. Her father, a police officer, believed it to be the work of a serial killer possibly posing as a traveling salesman, targeting young women along I-40 from Ohio to Asheville. Chills raced through me as I recounted my encounters with Jack, the unsettling conversation, and his sudden interest in me at the club. Despite sharing everything with my coworker's father, the police seemed to dismiss my concerns, perhaps due to my age and Jack's seemingly innocuous appearance. Sitting in my apartment that evening, the gravity of my narrow escape settled over me. If Jack was indeed the man the police were hunting, my age had possibly saved my life. The realization left me shaken, questioning how close I had come to becoming another of his victims, and how many others might not have been so fortunate. In the days following my revelation about Jack, a heavy unease settled over me. I found myself looking over my shoulder more often, startled by shadows and the ordinary sounds of my apartment. My usual haunt, the coffee shop where I had met Jack, now seemed tinged with the echo of our conversation, rendering it a place of apprehension rather than relaxation. Despite this, I forced myself to return, driven by a defiant refusal to let fear dictate my life. Meanwhile, the local news buzzed with the story of the murdered girl, and community concern grew palpable. Details were scarce, but the fear was palpable, infecting everyone with a morbid curiosity and an underlying dread. Each report echoed my own fears about Jack and his possible involvement. I couldn't help but feel frustrated and helpless knowing that my warning had been brushed aside, possibly delaying a critical investigation. Asheville, with its artsy vibe and welcoming community, had always felt like a safe haven. Now, it seemed as if a shadow had crept over our small city, a reminder that danger could lurk even in the most idyllic settings. My friends noticed the change in my demeanor. I was more cautious, more reserved. Tom, sensing my distress, tried to reassure me, suggesting perhaps Jack was just a disturbed old man with no real connection to the ongoing investigations. However, I couldn't shake the conviction that I had narrowly escaped a dangerous predator. Driven by this unsettling thought, I started doing some research of my own. I pored over online articles about crimes along the I-40 corridor, trying to find any information that might link Jack to other incidents. It was a long shot, but I clung to the hope that some piece of information might validate my suspicions and push the police into action. One evening, as I sifted through another batch of articles, a headline caught my eye: "Serial Suspect Seen in Tennessee." The article described a man of Jack's description, seen acting suspiciously around several bars in Knoxville. The police were calling for anyone with information to come forward. My heart raced as I read, each word reinforcing my belief that I had indeed encountered a monster. I called the Asheville Police Department the next morning, my hands trembling as I dialed the number. This time, I wasn't brushed off. The officer on the line listened intently as I recounted my encounters with Jack, my visit to the strip club, and the eerie conversation about his past. I mentioned the article from Tennessee, urging them to consider the possibility that Jack might be their suspect. Encouraged by their receptive response, I hung up feeling a mixture of relief and renewed anxiety. The following days were a blur of anxiety and cautious optimism. I was interviewed by detectives who took detailed notes and assured me they were taking my information seriously. They couldn't reveal much about their investigation, but their serious demeanor told me that they were considering Jack as a potential suspect in not just the local case, but possibly connected to other crimes along the interstate. Days turned into weeks with no public updates from the police. The lack of news was torturous. I spent my days fluctuating between hope that Jack would be caught and fear that he would vanish into the ether, his crimes buried in bureaucratic inertia. Then, late one evening, a detective called. They had arrested Jack in connection with multiple assaults across several states. Evidence found in his car and residence linked him to crimes far more extensive and brutal than anyone had initially suspected. The relief that washed over me was palpable, yet it was tempered by the knowledge of how close I had come to becoming a part of his grim tally. In the aftermath of Jack's arrest, Asheville slowly returned to its usual rhythm. Yet, the scars remained. I was more cautious now, forever changed by the encounter that had shown me the darkest capabilities of human nature. But I also grew stronger, more resilient, and more grateful for each uneventful, ordinary day that passed. The summer of 2006 was a season of newfound freedom for me. At 20 years old, I had recently acquired my driver's license, and the open road was my gateway to adventure. I reveled in the independence it granted me, allowing me to traverse the highways to visit friends scattered across the Northeast. My youthful appearance often led strangers to mistake me for a high schooler, a misunderstanding that usually amused me but sometimes left me feeling underestimated. On a particularly vibrant July day, I was en route to southern Pennsylvania for a weekend getaway with my friend, Clara. Her parents were out of town, and we had grand plans to indulge in the newly released Planet Earth series while enjoying her hot tub and perhaps a bit of carefree frolicking in nearby cornfields. The drive from Connecticut was smooth, filled with my favorite tunes and the scenic beauty of a Northeast summer, which always made me feel like I was driving through a postcard. Crossing from New Jersey into Pennsylvania marked the final leg of my journey. Intent on grabbing some snacks and filling up the tank, I pulled into one of the first rest stops I encountered, a nondescript place with a sizable mini-mart, typical of the interstate's offerings. I couldn't pinpoint its exact location later, but I distinctly remember its layout. The gas station with the mini-mart sat across from the on-ramp to I-78 West, with a nondescript dirt road running parallel to it. As I headed towards the store, my attention was drawn to a man emerging from a black pickup truck parked a few spaces from mine. Something about him struck me immediately. He was in his late 30s or early 40s, stocky and taller than my petite 5 feet 1 inch frame, dressed in a plain black tee and jeans. It wasn't his appearance that set off alarms, but the intense, unsettling energy he projected. His dark brown hair was trimmed neatly, and his mustache and goatee were meticulously groomed. But it was the piercing gaze and the odd, eager tilt of his smile that sent a shiver down my spine. He approached me with a purposefulness that felt invasive. "Hey there. You from around here?" he called out, despite the Connecticut plates clearly displayed on my car. His tone was overly familiar, his proximity uncomfortably close. He asked where I was headed and if I knew any fun spots around, as he had some time to kill before his plans later that evening. The conversation escalated quickly when he suggested we go play mini-golf or catch a movie together. I was taken aback by his forwardness. My instinct screamed that something was off, so I kept my answers vague and non-committal. Politely declining his invitation, I excused myself and hurried into the store, hoping that would be the end of it. But as I walked away, he shouted after me, "You're gorgeous." His voice was loud, jarring, and it carried an aggressive undertone that made me uneasy. A family exiting the store glanced at him, visibly startled by the outburst. Inside, I pretended to browse the aisles while keeping a watchful eye on the entrance. True to my fears, he followed me in. His gaze lingered too long, unblinking and unsettling. Seeking refuge, I ducked into the bathroom, where I stayed holed up for about 10 minutes, texting Clara about the creepy man. When I finally emerged, he was gone. Relief washed over me as I took my time selecting snacks, sour bright crawlers, and trail mix, my road trip staples. After paying, I walked out to my car, fueled up, and prepared to leave, grateful to see that his truck was no longer in the parking lot. However, as I approached the on-ramp to rejoin I-78, I heard the unmistakable sound of a car horn blaring. Chills ran down my spine as I saw him again, on the dirt road parallel to the ramp, wildly honking and gesturing for me to come over. He had been waiting for me, watching which way I would go. Panicked, I accelerated onto the highway, my heart pounding as I left him behind. I immediately called Clara, my voice shaking as I recounted what had happened. She was alarmed and instructed me to drive directly to a police station if he appeared again. Thankfully, he did not follow for long. After a few tense miles, I saw him exit the highway. Clara and I stayed on the phone together until I felt safe, and we made plans for an alternate route to her house in case he somehow found me again. The rest of the drive was nerve-wracking. I kept glancing in my rearview mirror, half expecting to see his black pickup truck looming behind me. But I arrived at Clara's house without further incident, and we tried to make the best of the weekend, despite the shadow the encounter cast over our plans. Little did I know that this unsettling experience would resurface years later, linking to a far more sinister context than I could have ever imagined. The weekend passed with Clara and I trying our best to immerse ourselves in the fun and freedom we had planned. But the shadows of my highway encounter lingered in the back of my mind. Every laugh and sip of wine was tinged with the aftertaste of fear, and despite the warmth of friendship and the distraction of our activities, I couldn't shake off the chill from that man's intense gaze. Years drifted by, and the incident became a distant, if unsettling, memory, until a late autumn evening in 2014 when it resurfaced with chilling clarity. I was at a small gathering with friends, the kind where stories of past adventures and misadventures tend to surface. As we chatted, the topic turned to scary encounters, and I, half-jokingly, brought up my experience from 2006. My friend, Jess, who had always had a fascination with true crime, was particularly intrigued. "You know, that sounds eerily like a serial killer I read about who was active around Pennsylvania during that time," Jess said, her tone serious. The casual mood around us dimmed as she pulled out her phone, urging me to describe the man again. Late 30s or early 40s, stocky, dark brown hair with a mustache and goatee, I recounted, the image of the man growing clearer and more sinister in my mind as I spoke. Jess quickly typed into her search, her eyes widening as she read. "Look at this," she said, turning her screen toward me. The first hit was a mugshot of a man named Adam Leroy Lane. The article detailed his crimes along the I-78 corridor, including assaults and murders that fit the timeline of my encounter. His physical description matched chillingly with my memory of the man at the rest stop. I stared at the screen, my heart pounding. The man in the photo was slightly heavier than I remembered, but the resemblance was uncanny. Adam Leroy Lane had been convicted of several brutal attacks on women, and his operational area and timeline matched my own story too closely for comfort. "It could be a coincidence, but it's a huge one if it is," Jess murmured, scrolling through more articles that painted a horrifying picture of Lane's crimes. That night, I went home with a heavy heart, the ghosts of what-ifs haunting me. What if I had been more naive or less cautious? What if he had followed me all the way to Clara's house? The encounter I had brushed off as a creepy but isolated incident now felt like a narrow escape from a much darker fate. The realization that I had possibly faced a serial killer didn't just scare me. It changed the way I perceived my past adventures. The freedom I once felt, roaming the roads to visit friends and explore new places, now seemed fraught with unseen dangers. I became more cautious, more aware of my surroundings, and less trusting of strangers. Sharing my story became a way to process the fear and reclaim some of the power that the encounter had taken from me. Each telling helped desensitize the panic and normalize the reality that I had survived. It also served as a cautionary tale to others about the importance of vigilance and trusting one's instincts. Though years have passed since that summer day in 2006, the lessons remain. The open road still calls to me, but I answer with a more watchful eye and a deeper appreciation for the safety of home. The world is vast and full of wonder, but it is also shadowed by risks that we sometimes only understand in hindsight. As I continue to travel and explore, I do so with a heightened sense of awareness, a stronger trust in my instincts, and a grateful acknowledgement of just how fragile and precious our sense of security can be. In my early 20s, right after college, I found myself in a predicament familiar to many fresh graduates. High aspirations tethered to a meager budget. This led me to rent an apartment in a less than desirable part of town where the rent was cheap, but the living conditions left much to be desired. One of the most notorious features of my apartment was the paper-thin walls, which seemed to amplify every sound from my neighbors, turning private lives into public broadcasts. Living there, I quickly became accustomed to the various noises. The muffled conversations, the late-night TV marathons, and most notably, the constant blare of music from my left-hand neighbor. Oddly enough, the relentless beats became a bizarre sort of company in the solitude of my unit. On most days, I combated the noise with a playlist of my own, a modest shield against the sonic invasion. My neighbor, whom I'll call Mike, was an enigmatic figure. From what little I knew, he seemed to lead a tumultuous life marked by frequent late-night revelries and louder-than-life arguments with his girlfriend. These disturbances were routine enough that I had learned to dismiss them as just another part of urban apartment living. However, one night, the situation escalated in a way that was impossible to ignore. It was a Friday evening, and from the sounds permeating the wall, it was clear Mike had been drinking. The clatter of stumbling footsteps was followed by the rise and fall of angry voices, his louder than hers, aggressive and unsettling. This wasn't the first time their arguments had filled the corridor, but something about the intensity that night felt alarmingly different. Seeking respite from the brewing storm next door, I decided to head out. The evening was still young, and the city's nightlife beckoned. A few friends and I hit up some local clubs, immersing ourselves in the pulsating lights and thumping bass, a welcome distraction from my domestic disturbances. The night wore on, a blur of laughter and dance floors, until the clock nudged toward 1 a.m. As my friends and I drove back to my apartment, the buzz of the evening was abruptly undercut by an unsettling sight in the parking lot. There, crouched between two cars near the dimly lit facade of my building, was Mike. His presence alone wasn't unusual, but his behavior was bizarre. He seemed to be hiding, or perhaps waiting. My friends tensed up, instantly uneasy at the sight. Though I appreciated their concern, I downplayed the weirdness, chalking it up to just another oddity in the life of my peculiar neighbor. I had them drop me off at the gate, simplifying their exit and shortening my walk. But as I approached my building, my heart sank. There, in the shadows of the bushes that lined the walkway, stood Mike. He was perfectly still, almost blending into the darkness, watching. Adrenaline coursed through me, but I forced a calm exterior. Making eye contact, I raised my hand in a tentative wave and offered a muted, "Hey," hoping to defuse any potential danger in acknowledging his presence. He stepped out into the dim light of the street lamp, and the sight of his wide, dilated eyes sent a chill down my spine. There was something profoundly disturbing in his gaze, a depth of darkness I hadn't seen before. I hurried past him, my heart pounding in my ears, and made a beeline for my door. Once inside, I locked it behind me and collapsed against it, my breaths shallow and rapid. I was safe, physically at least, but the encounter left me shaken. As I tried to sleep, the night's earlier disturbances replayed in my mind, accompanied by the intermittent thumps and rustles from next door, sounds that now seemed ominous rather than merely annoying. Morning light brought a superficial calm, but it was shattered by the sound of police knocking loudly on Mike's door. The severity of the situation unfolded rapidly. I watched, a silent observer behind my peephole, as officers led Mike away in handcuffs. When they knocked on my door next, I recounted everything. The argument, the odd behavior in the parking lot, and the unsettling noises throughout the night. What they told me next would haunt me forever. Mike had murdered his girlfriend that night, in the midst of their heated argument. The noises I had heard were the aftermath of his horrific act. The reality that I had been so close to a violent killer, oblivious to the gravity of the situation just beyond my thin walls, was profoundly disturbing. Haunted by the tragedy and the proximity to such brutality, I resolved to move. No amount of cheap rent was worth this kind of risk. I needed a fresh start, somewhere I could feel safe. A place where the walls didn't echo with the echoes of my neighbor's darkest moments. In the days following the arrest, my apartment felt more like a crime scene than a home. The police were frequent visitors, piecing together the timeline of that fateful night, their questions painting a chilling picture of the violence that had unfolded just feet from where I slept. The gravity of having shared a wall with such brutality weighed heavily on me, turning every shadow into a potential threat and every sound into a cause for alarm. I learned that Mike had been living a double life, one that those around him, including myself, had only glimpsed through the thin veil of apartment walls and brief encounters. The man I had casually nodded to in the hallway was capable of unimaginable violence. The realization that the jovial music and raucous laughter I had often heard were mere facades for a darker reality was deeply unsettling. The community around the apartment complex was shaken by the event. Neighbors spoke in hushed tones, exchanging stories and information about Mike and his girlfriend, trying to make sense of the senseless. I found myself retreating further into my shell, my trust in my ability to judge character fundamentally shaken. As I prepared to move, I spent my days packing boxes, each item I packed a reminder of the life I was leaving behind. Not just possessions, but the remnants of a naive belief in the safety of my surroundings. The friendly nods and superficial chats with neighbors were replaced by a cautious distance, the community's once comforting familiarity now a source of anxiety. The move to a new apartment in a better part of town was both a logistical challenge and an emotional relief. I chose a place with stricter security measures, a newer building where the walls promised more than just physical separation from my neighbors. As I settled into my new environment, the absence of Mike's music was eerily noticeable, replaced by the quiet hum of a safer, more isolated existence. Yet, the transition was not just about physical relocation. It was a mental and emotional journey from a place of vulnerability to one of cautious resilience. The events that unfolded in my previous apartment taught me the hard way about the unpredictability of human nature and the thin line between normalcy and nightmare. Engaging with my new neighbors was a gradual process, colored by the lingering trauma of my recent experiences. I was more reserved, more observant, and admittedly, more suspicious. Friendships that once might have formed quickly now took time. As I carefully navigated the waters of new relationships, always mindful of the potential depths below the surface. The experience also spurred a deeper introspection about my own responses to danger and my instincts for self-preservation. I found myself more attuned to my surroundings, more diligent in observing the comings and goings around me. The carefree confidence of my early 20s gave way to a more measured, aware existence. Months passed, and the sharp edges of memory began to blur, softened by the routine of new experiences and the comforts of a safer home. Yet, the lessons remained, imprinted on my psyche as indelibly as ink on paper. I was more aware of my environment, more appreciative of the peace I now enjoyed, and infinitely more grateful for the mundane, uneventful days. It was mid-July 2019, and the typical serenity of Maplewood, Minnesota, was about to be shattered, unbeknownst to me as I returned home on that sweltering afternoon. The sun was relentless, a blazing sphere in the sky that scorched everything beneath it, turning the pavement into a stovetop that tested the endurance of my worn sneakers. I recall the air was thick with heat, heavy enough to make breathing a chore, and the light had a sharp quality to it, casting deep shadows even in midday. I had just made a quick run to the local grocery store, the kind of errand you try to rush through just to escape the oppressive heat. By 3 p.m., the streets of Maplewood were unusually quiet. On a normal day, the laughter of children playing and the occasional hum of a lawn mower filled the air, creating a backdrop of suburban bliss. But that day, an eerie stillness hung over the neighborhood, a stillness that felt as if it were waiting to be broken. As I turned onto my street, arms laden with groceries that seemed to grow heavier with each step, I couldn't shake a creeping sense of unease. It was the kind of feeling you get when something is amiss, but you can't quite put your finger on what. The street was too quiet. The cheerful, noisy bustle of daily life was conspicuously absent, replaced by a suffocating silence that made my skin prickle uncomfortably. Reaching my house, a modest, one-story building with peeling white paint and a porch that spoke of better days, I hurried inside, grateful for the brief respite from the heat. It was then that I noticed a flyer slipped under the door, its bold lettering immediately catching my eye. It was a community alert warning of a series of break-ins around our area. The suspect was still at large. Reading those words, a chill ran through me despite the heat, a stark reminder that not all was well in our quiet town. I locked the door behind me, something I seldom felt the need to do during the day, and tried to shake off the unease as I put away my groceries. The mundane tasks of laundry and preparing dinner should have been enough to distract me, but the flyer's warning lingered in the back of my mind, casting a shadow over the afternoon. Around 6 p.m., as I was chopping vegetables for dinner, a sharp knock at the door jolted me from my routine. Approaching cautiously, I peered through the peephole and saw a man I didn't recognize. He appeared to be in his late 30s, with sharp, angular features and an intensity in his eyes that was unnerving. He wore a plain gray t-shirt, slightly too tight around his muscular frame, and faded jeans that had seen better days. "Can I help you?" I called through the door, keeping the chain securely latched. "Hi, sorry to bother you," he began, his voice smooth, almost too practiced. "My car broke down a few blocks over, and my phone's dead. Could I use your phone to call for a tow?" There was something about him that set off alarm bells in my mind. Perhaps it was the way his gaze seemed too calculating, or how he shifted his weight, subtly sizing up the door frame. Instinctively, I hesitated, then offered a compromise. I can make the call for you if you give me the number." He smiled then, a smile that didn't quite reach his eyes, making them seem all the colder. "That would be great. Thank you," he replied, his gratitude sounding rehearsed. I closed the door, making sure it was locked, and went to fetch my phone. As I dialed the local towing service, a nagging thought troubled me. What if he was involved in the break-ins mentioned in the flyer? I quickly dismissed it as paranoia. It was broad daylight, after all, and surely no one would attempt anything now. After arranging the tow, I returned to the door to relay the information. He thanked me with another of those unsettling smiles and turned to leave, casting one last piercing look my way that left me uneasy for reasons I couldn't quite articulate. Later that evening, as I sat watching the news, a report sent a cold shiver down my spine. The police had apprehended the suspect responsible for the recent break-ins. His picture flashed on the screen, and my heart stopped. It was the man who had been at my door earlier. The report went further, revealing that he was also a suspect in a brutal murder case in the neighboring county. I sat frozen, the implications of the encounter washing over me in a chilling wave. If I had been less cautious, if I had ignored that subtle instinctual warning, I might not have been safe in my home that night. As the sun set and the shadows deepened, the comforting outlines of my familiar kitchen seemed to whisper sinister what-ifs, each more terrifying than the last. The day's heat lingered into the night, a stifling blanket of humidity that seemed to press down on me with the heavy realization of just how narrow my escape had been. The night following the news broadcast was restless. Sleep eluded me, chased away by the chilling realization of how closely danger had brushed against my life. Each creak and sigh of the house set me on edge, transforming the familiar into specters of what might have been. The man's image, captured in the harsh light of a mugshot on TV, replayed in my mind, a stark reminder of the encounter that had nearly turned my safe haven into a crime scene. The following morning, the world outside seemed different, as if a veil had been lifted to reveal a harsher, more menacing reality. The neighborhood, once a tableau of suburban tranquility, now felt exposed and vulnerable. My usual morning routine, a casual stroll to pick up the newspaper and a friendly wave to the neighbors, was tinged with a new wariness. The faces I met carried a similar strain. The news of the arrest had spread, disturbing the peace and leaving a communal sense of vulnerability in its wake. Compelled by a newfound sense of responsibility, I reached out to the local police department to report the previous day's encounter. The officer on duty listened intently as I described the man and his request for help with a supposedly broken-down car. I learned then that this ruse was one he had used before, a predatory tactic to assess potential targets. They thanked me for the information, noting it could be helpful in building a stronger case against him, given his pattern of behavior.